The core of my work on this channel is exposing players to games that they've never heard of. That's probably how you heard about this channel in the first place, my list of overlooked games during the year. And while I do review a good amount of them before the list comes out, I sometimes don't get the chance to fully review all of them. Too many good games, and some of them intersect with each other. And, well, to make a list, I have to play a lot of them. But, looking back on my list of the past, I do think that I have an obligation to try at least to review the top 3 games of the year. And this is my first step towards that. Taking the slot of number 3 on my overlooked games of 2024, Bloomtown: A Different Story is an RPG that focuses on the Persona formula, but is set in a more rural area of Illinois. It released on the PC, specifically Steam, as well as the PS4 and 5, the Xbox Series X and S, and a Nintendo Switch. It costs $24.99 and comes in around 10 to 18 hours depending on how much side content that you do, even as low as 6 in some cases if you're speedrunning through it. Now, I played on the PC for the purposes of review, coming in around 19 hours of Steam and hitting every side quest that I could in my first playthrough. But the question is, will hitting the whole game change my opinion at all? Or maybe retroactively bump it up the overlooked games list? Let's find out, shall we? The game begins with Emily and her brother Chester riding on a bus. It's summer vacation, and apparently Emily's parents don't want to deal with them on top of their marital issues, so they get sent to their grandfather's house in the rural town of Bloomtown. You get settled and learn that your summer may not be so rosy with your grandfather being a stick in the mud. But hey, what's childhood without some hurdles to overcome? And a whole city of people and places to explore, which Bloomtown seems to have. A rundown train station, a baseball park, and stores aplenty. No sooner than you arrive than you are asked by other kids to help find one of their friends. And well, this of course leads Emily to find a door to another dimension. As you do. We all went through this childhood ritual. This spirals into Emily immediately finding herself in front of a demon who's seemingly going to sacrifice the child. And while you don't know if the child truly deserved it, you escape thanks to a guardian demon that seemingly protects you. However, this leads to, of course, a grand adventure where you figure out what is plaguing the town and how to stop it. If you're seeing a lot of parallels to the basic structure of the Persona games with the setup, yeah, you're not alone. And honestly, the comparison of this being Persona plus Stranger Things does do a good job of generalizing the plot to a new player. But I don't want you to assume anything by that description, because while Bloomtown may look like Persona on the surface, it's actually a bit different, especially when it comes to the character elements and the overall arching plot. And the characters, which is where I want to start. One of the things that worried me when I first saw the game was the characters' ages. Specifically not young adult, but not child either, just somewhere in that sort of 13-15 range. The thing is, a lot of writers struggle in that age area when it comes to designing dialogue and characters, because there's a very, very fine line between an annoying character who's young and realistic. Too much sass and jokes, and the characters can start to wear on even the most child-friendly person. Too little, and they don't seem to really react to being young and inexperienced, like they're adults in child bodies. Luckily, Bloomtown surprisingly gets this right throughout its runtime. It's clear that the kids are there to have fun, and they take the moments to enjoy life despite what's going on, like messing with sidewalk art, throwing water balloons at people, or getting into cringy dance battles. And yet, there is an appeal to each character and how they handle things and sort of distinguishes them from the next. For example, Chester's rebellious nature and yet comical tone helps to ground situations even in the most darkest of circumstances. but actually can get a good laugh out of you as well. Ramona's more mature nature comes through as sort of a mediator of the group at times, but it also allows her inner struggles to manifest when needed. But what makes this all work is the inclusion of Hugo, our fourth party member, who just so happens to be a corgi, who, well, I won't spoil anything, but he can communicate with everyone in the party, and yes, that's not the spoiler. He acts like the veteran of the group, the mentor, the one who's able to put things into perspective. But he is also able to join in the fun and with the group, especially playing to his nature as a dog. He's the adult, but he's not an adult. Now, everything is better with a dog, of course. That much is a fact, as I'm a loving corgi owner myself. But Hugo stands out because he brings such a unique perspective to the story, which isn't uncommon in this game with other characters, but his specific take is one I haven't seen in a good bit, and gives really good reasoning for his personality and his wants. To mirror off that, character stories and backgrounds is where the writing shines the most, as it has the emotional depth and tugs on the heartstrings, but equally doesn't hold back on the darker moments of human nature. I mean, the game allows for death, it allows for sadness, but it also makes that sadness and darkness purposeful, to either teach a lesson or make the player feel something emotional. And 9 times out of 10, it works. The prime example of this is Ramona, who has a fractured relationship with her father and is acting as a single parent. Like many parts of the story, the game isn't shy in showing the darker parts of the story, showing how tired Ramona is, that her father is legitimately making her life worse. But it's also able to show the weaknesses of the father and how he's struggling being both the kind and the authoritative parent. This isn't clean, but it's all the better for it. You feel what she's going through, but you also feel what the father's going through. It's not easy raising a kid. I also have to say that the writing does a good job of balancing the serious moments with its humorous writing, and humor that honestly I felt was better than I expected going into it. I know that's somewhat weird to say, but I was expecting a lot more juvenile humor given the subject matter, fart jokes and whatnot, which would have made sense for some of the characters, like Chester for example, but I was pleasantly surprised. It's not that the humor is highbrow, mind you, but it feels like the humor is creative and uses everything in its arsenal. Puns, satire, and a variety of other different styles that make sense for the characters involved. I especially like the dry type humor that Hugo has. Alright, I've given a lot of praise to the story, and I think the story is one of the strong elements of the game, but that doesn't mean there aren't downsides to it. It does feel at times that the game is almost like in a chapter-like format, to the point where sometimes the chapters can feel a little bit disconnected from each other. This especially goes with the overall evil within the town. You feel like the game, at least at the start, is going to build up that element more. Maybe with like a seedy overlord that you saw in Persona 5 and Shido, for example, or something along that line. But Bloomtown never gets to that point. And while there being separate events makes sense at all, and there are evil in the world that, aren't connected to each other, it also does weaken the idea that everything is interconnected in terms of fate, and a little bit about some of the early game elements regarding deals made. I won't spoil that, at least in terms of what exactly I'm talking about there, but just be aware that some of the callbacks and elements like that don't work as well as I think they should. In addition, I will say that I feel like the ending was a little bit rushed and felt a little flat for me. To be frank, it felt like maybe there was an extra chapter that was meant to be before the ending, and time and budget just said no. It's just that the last portion of the game doesn't feel like a conclusion that really wraps up the storylines that I would expect, especially with the evils within the town. Some characters are wrapped up a little bit, but others are sort of left, holding the bag. Now, I obviously don't want to spoil things in terms of specific problems that I have because I want you to play the game. Yeah, that's a spoiler that I'm going to recommend the game. Big surprise. But I will say that in terms of the ending, I could see some people enjoy it, and some people would be very encouraged by the ending in terms of it not being over the top or it making sense for the game that was written. But in terms of me, in terms of the stories that I specifically like, I really like the focus on characters and character growth and a conclusion to arcs. And some of them just felt like they needed to be pushed a little more. I will say that Hugo in particular is one that I would point out, but I won't get into why. With me talking way too much about the story at this point, let's move on to the gameplay, which should be familiar to anyone who's played a Persona RPG, but we'll break it into combat and non-combat elements. Now, this is a turn-based RPG, which uses the basics that you would expect from the genre. You have basic physical attacks and the ability to defend, which actually does make a big difference in this game, but more on that later. You also have a ranged weapon, which has a limited amount of shots in the dungeon until you get a place to refill/reheal. Of course, they change for every character, from a nice rifle for Chester to a not over the top at all rocket launcher for Hugo. Seriously, only the best for the best boy. But the big key here, of course, is the magic. Each character has their own inner guardian demon that represents their core character in some way. Ramona, for example, has the marionette puppet, symbolizing how she feels like she's being pulled by the strings of fate and her father. Then there's Chester, who has a T-Rex with a laser gun, which symbolizes... Actually, I think it's just cool, and I think his personality overrides the symbolism with what he likes. This game, each character has a subset of abilities thanks to that guardian, which, unlike Persona, is configurable with choices to make upon level up. But each character can also equip another demon to give the characters a little bit of flexibility in their design. And that goes a long way, as I'll lead to in a bit. There are a few key elements about this combat system, and the first is, of course, weaknesses and resistances, which act very Persona-like. Weaknesses to the right spell will not only hit for extra damage, but will put non-boss characters in a down state. If you're able to hit all enemies down before your party's turn is over, you get a chance to do an all-out attack to do mega damage, or to capture a demon to add to your collection, which can be used to augment your other demons, or just give you new options that you didn't have before. I point this out because of the flip side. Resistances are significant where they will take a significant chunk out of your damage you are doing and really can't be ignored, especially when dealing with those that have physical attack resistances, which is usually the bread and butter of, well, this is an okay option and I don't have a lot of other choices in most games. Those battles will start to get stretched out if you don't pay attention to resistances, and it highlights the game's use of combinations of monsters in an area. Certain areas will have a good selection of monsters that hit most of the resistances over the series of monsters, but some will be more common, so setting up your team to succeed is doable if you pay attention. It's unlike Persona here though, because there's no Joker here. You're not going to get one party member who can deal with any threat. You're going to have to think about how you make your team. The other part of combat that you should pay attention to is statuses. Statuses really mean something in Bloomtown, for a multitude of reasons, but they are a little bit different than what you would expect, especially in the RPG genre. For example, there is poison in this game, but unlike traditional RPGs where it deals damage over time, what poison does here is weaken the player so they don't do a lot of damage. Meanwhile, something like Woozed will not allow you to use magic and will make it harder to hit your physical attacks. Your accuracy goes down, almost begging you to defend with the character. On top of that, certain statuses will combo with each other, allowing for additional significant damage that could take huge chunks out of the enemy. But beware, some statuses only last for a turn, so setting up for it can be a game in itself. I found that I enjoyed combat for the most part, and wasn't getting bored in terms of encounters, for multiple reasons, but more on that in the presentation element. There was enough here to keep me entertained, and the game wasn't rehashing battles one after another so that I would get bored with the same thing over and over again. It kept on stirring things up enough that I never settled into a groove, and reintroduced combination of enemies in the right amount and balance. In fact, balance does seem to be a key element here, as I really did enjoy the magic usage and pointing of that magic in particular. Each spell seemed to have gone through iterations of balance and gave the right amount of power for the right amount of magic spent. There wasn't one spell that I would constantly go back to in every situation and keep on using it, not being overpowered unless if I really paid for it. I want to highlight specifically that I didn't necessarily understand some of the complexity of this combat until I went and looked at footage later on. There were possibilities that could have gotten rid of some of the problems that I was having that I just didn't think about. If you were watching me stream the game over on Twitch, you'll note that one of the complaints that I did have was that a lot of the boss characters would take a round in their multi-turn steps, aka they got multiple turns after you got one turn, that they would use it to heal up. And in some cases, that heal was so significant because of all the statuses present that I wasn't making a lot of progress, which was a hurdle to overcome, sure, but in some cases it felt a little bit unfair. Well, I went back and looked at the footage, and I realized something. Remember that woozed status? Yeah, I could have used spells to get around that problem and force them not to cast heal. Now granted, there are bosses that are immune to it, and some will have general resistances to it that it may not have been worth it. But I also never thought to try it, only realizing it after the fact. And it's sort of funny because I think the game did give it a fight early on, sort of showing the woo status being effective at that. It's funny because that balance that I talk about is present in the combat, and yet it also has a downside. To a certain extent? See, there's the influence of the non-combat elements having to do with the more endurance portion of combat in consecutive battles. The best example I can use is a drawn-out boss fight that you see here, with two of the characters in particular. This fight was challenging because there was only two characters I had, and I was literally running on fumes because I didn't have a lot of items going into the fight, and well, I started running into the problems, missing hits, and the boss is healing at that point, and well, I'm running into issues. It forced me to make hard decisions and actually go for the kill at a certain point that I really wasn't comfortable with. But it was also very entertaining. It actually really highlighted some of the strengths of the battle system. Which you may say, okay, Dragnix, that sounds good. And that also happens in Persona 2 and in most other RPGs. So what the hell is your problem? I'm going to again look at Persona for this. See, Persona actually had a small balancer that you may not have realized to help with that specific issue. Its time element. You had to do a dungeon and steal a heart in a certain amount of days. And yes, you could use those days to gain resources and everything to help you with a big boss fight at the end of that time. But it was finite. But here, it's infinite. You can take as long as you want to bake all the pies in the world to heal you up. You can be the grandma that literally just stays in the kitchen all the time so that you can just have 99 pies when you go into battle. And the thing is, I don't know how I feel about that choice. I mean, I didn't have to do that if I didn't want to, and it's a good idea for an adaptive difficulty option for players who want to do a little bit more in terms of preparation. It lowers the difficulty for them. But yet I sit here wondering if it could have forced the issue and forced people to see the complexity of the battle system if they were forced to deal with the limited resources. Look, even though I've played a lot of RPGs, I played this game on normal because, well, that's what most people are going to play, and it's what I wanted to experience. But if you have any sort of experience at RPGs, specifically the Persona franchise, I would play this game on hard, because when the combat system is working and grooving, it really does feel that good in terms of your choices mattering and giving you the difficulty you probably want. If you're wanting a little bit easier, yeah, choose normal. You'll still get a good amount out of combat. It's just that you won't get as much if you use some of the options for the side content. Moving on from the combat. Like Persona, there are outside combat elements that can help move stories along and build relationships in a confidant-like system. There's a couple of elements here, but let's start with that relationship element. There are a collection of characters that you can hang out with during the day, in your party and outside your party, and you go through scripted events and build your relationship. As you do this, you will get extra benefits in battle, and these can be significant. It could be not using an item at a key time, or even automatically countering an attack if an attack misses you. If you do play Bloomtown, I will say do all of these. Not just for the combat benefits, but for the actual stories, because they are some of the best. But other than that, you do have other quests and side activities to do in town, and they hit a bigger gambit than I would expect. For example, remember how I said that the combat section that you could make your own recovery items? Well, there's actually a bunch of ways to do it. I mean, you have to cook it in the kitchen, of course, but you can fish to gather some of the ingredients. Which I will say that I did enjoy the little hints the game gave to find all the different types of fish. You could also farm in the backyard. I do sort of wonder how Grandpa had all this in the back and didn't bother to do anything with it, but that's a question for another day. Like Persona, you do get prompts with some of the side quests where you can use your stats that you can roll and do a check against them, which sort of works and sort of doesn't. There's 4 main stats that you can check against, and sometimes you get a choice of which stat to roll against, which can work when you aren't taking into account the fact that time in this game doesn't restrict you. You can upgrade those stats in the world by finding crosswords to do, reading on benches, a bunch of different activities. And with no time elements, you can literally become the jack of all trades and thus always, succeed. But I want to reiterate that the side quests and different activities do serve a greater purpose in the story and the overall feeling of the game. It makes the town feel like a sizable yet rural town, and that meant something to me. I was raised in the country, and this town was like St. Charles, where I lived. Sizable with a bunch of different areas and a real life to it. It captures that in all the activities from farming to the local gym and record store. It made me want to see everything the game had to offer just for that sort of nostalgia element, which is weird when you think about it because I'm a YouTuber now and I don't go out very much. Well, I go out a lot more than I used to, thanks to the fiance. You know what? Regardless, it captured a lot of my childhood in it, which was surprising to me and actually worked very, very well. I do want to make it clear, however, that players should really pay attention to people's names in this game and with things that are being said in the text. Which sounds stupid, but the game has quest markers, giving you an idea of which small map section that a quest can be done in. It won't always be very specific. Sometimes it'll show you the specific house you need to go to, but other times it won't. And the map is very useful, by the way. It could teleport you around and allow you to make quick progress. But quests will have hints if it's not specific. It could be a person's name of what you need to do, which means you really need to pay attention to people's names. The one quest regarding a flower I didn't do for a good amount of the game is because I literally forgot where the person was and I couldn't remember who the lady was by the name alone. And at one point, I just went to every single house and said, hey, are you it? Hey, are you it? Hey, are you it? Yeah, a little dumb on my part. Finally, let's talk about the presentation, because quite frankly, it may be the strongest element of the game in a lot of ways, and that's saying something considering some of the other game's strengths. It would be remiss of me to not start with the music this time around, because, well, I'm still listening to it to this day. Now, obviously, I've made a lot of comparisons to Persona throughout this review, but if you hear the music, you'll immediately understand why. Now, for some reason, people may be under the impression that the music may not be quality specifically because the vocals are involved. There's a weird impression that in order for vocals to be good, it has to have a massive budget or be AAA in terms of games. Let me visually show you exactly how that opinion should be approached.
しっかり足を踏み出して、体重を移動しながら腰をひねり、肩に力を伝えて、
Listen, I may be in my late 30s, but this music is banging. I promise I will never ever say that again. The vocals are fantastic. It has its own energy that really infuses the battle with action. And to be quite honest, it actually causes a problem. The problem being is that I want to extend battles to hear more of the tracks. Now, there isn't a lot of the main vocal tracks, mind you, but every one of them are fantastic. And the only real problem is that I would love a little more variety because I do feel a little bit of repetition in certain battle-heavy areas. With that said, it still overcomes that with... Actually, I'm not going to just explain it. Just listen for yourself. Hear what I'm talking about.
Oh, I just need you to let me bloom, and I don't need this empty room. Don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't let me go. In the middle, never end night. In the middle of night. All the way into the past, there's someone I could trust. Take a moment to rely. I'm not going to lose my mind, forcing those memories to stop breathing. In this story of yours and mine, fading away 'cause it's all deceiving. Bringing back from the dust, I was crawling to uncover what was. I tried to see that it's never enough for me. I must believe any wonder will help me. You try to see not for me. You are for me. You are for me. A spark of hope I find will stay along with me. I rise above to solve this mystery in me.
Now, the non-vocal tracks are right in setting the mood, and they do a good job of providing some basic background noise, but honestly, it's sort of criminal to compare the two to each other. Here's a short excerpt of them. The sound design is a little bit more complicated, however. See, battle noises that you expect are there, and provide good indicators of hits and the general type of attacks that you're using. But it also sometimes feels a little bit off. A spear hitting the ground, for example, and doing a sharp-like attack does sound right. And wind attacks sound like they have a blade element to it, like they're cutting the wind, which makes sense. But when using an ice attack and that having a big thud for it in terms of hitting the enemy, it makes sense at first because it's a big piece of matter smacking them, but it also doesn't have a ting of coldness to it, like what you would expect to hear for a freezing effect. With that said, I found a lot of the sound effects related to menus and interactions to be crisp and easy to hear, making sense for what they needed to portray information-wise. There's good interaction sounds when they're used with the environment, and there's always something to a good slap sound effect. Take a listen to some variety here, and hear what I'm talking about. Finally, let's talk about the game's visuals. The game's style is strong from the top down, especially from a design perspective. Monsters in this game feel familiar and yet have a real great sense of simplicity and complexity at the same time. Like, I've heard the term Onion Knight, of course, but taking that and making a literal Onion Knight, with the shield being the inside of an onion, yeah, that's some good shit. In fact, I was looking forward to every new monster that I came across, just to see how creative the designs would get. I've shown you some of my favorites since starting this paragraph, and now I'm gonna end it, because I would be here all day if I did all the ones that I liked. What I really love about the combat environments, and in particular the combat areas, is that there's a lot of little details that you can miss if you are just not paying attention, like the eyes at the bottom of the screen there. It's also the details like the actual shades on the wood that add to the aged look of the wood. Yes, the cracks help, but the fact that you have levels of light on it so that some parts seem to be more worn than others actually adds to the ambiance of everything. It's just that in environments that are repetitious in nature, where you're seeing them over and over again, this game was pretty unique in the fact that even though I was battling in an area over and over again, I was finding more details every time I battled, which is saying something. The animations are more where it is hit and miss. It's mostly hits, but every now and again it's a miss. Things like the fire on the fire cat here. Fantastic. It adds a lot of energy to the creature in question. The tail moving around like a fire would, but also like a cat's tail would, is impressive in terms of its motion. I really love the little ripples of the water at the bottom of the screen. Everything here works. And even the subtle movement of Ramona here does add to the, oh, I'm waiting to do my attack. But then you get animations like our exercise here. Like, I get it. It's a kid. She's doing exercises. They're not going to be very, very extravagant, but just something doesn't seem right here for an activity that you're doing that you're supposed to only be staring at the screen. You can't do anything during this time. It just feels like it needs to do a little bit more in order to get my attention. But really, when it comes down to it, it's a game that does stand out in terms of its presentation from an indie standpoint, especially with some of the lighting elements, like the little lava here and the grate that has the glow under it. It's a game that I didn't want to stop looking at And even when the game was repetitious in terms of battles or enemies, I didn't really mind it because I was just looking at something that I like to look at. In the end, Bloomtown, A Different Story, mirrors Persona in several ways, but finds its own take on its formula enough to stand out as an indie gem to play. Great characters highlight some wonderful sub-stories that get emotional in the right ways, and keeps you wanting to explore and find more. The combat has the formula to keep you fighting throughout the game, although veterans of the genre will want to play on hard to really challenge themselves. While I did find the conclusion of the game to be a little weak, it doesn't overshadow the strong music, wonderful visuals, and everything coming together in just a great package. Is it the best indie RPG that I've played in the last few years? No, that still goes to Virgo vs. the Zodiac, but it's still a must-buy, coming in at a 93 out of 100. But that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective element of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories on screen strongly, add or subtract that score to your main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability rating for you. As you can see, there aren't a lot of situations or specific combinations that I wouldn't recommend Bloomtown, whether it is buy it right now or buy it when you can. The fact is, it's a solid game across the board and has something for most everybody, unless if you really, really hate the genre, which, why are you watching this video this far into it then? Anyway, that's it for this review. If you liked this review, hit that like button and maybe share it with a friend. And if you want to see more reviews like this, hit that subscribe button. Although, it may be a little bit until I get another review out. Well, part of the reason why it's gonna take a little bit of time is that I am getting married in 9 days. It's part of the reason why this review took so long. Partly because I had some writer's block and I had to change a bunch of stuff, but part is because I'm all over the place between work and, trying to deal with other things. So, yeah, it may be a little bit of time. Granted, I'm still working on the remix video, and I do have that somewhat edited. I still need to add to it, but I will get back into the groove probably in March. On top of that, I am going to stream the rest of the week, and I'll put the schedule in the comments below. Anyway, that's it for now. And as always, keep on gaming.